Welcome to the Wing Chun Discussion Podcast with your hosts, Dane and Vito, interviewing Wing Chun practitioners and instructors, expanding the world of Wing Chun. So we had a great episode. We had Kai Taylor on.
Yeah, he was super interesting.
And he was super interesting. I thought so too. He was throwing philosophy our way. And I actually really enjoyed that, I think, because of my psychology background. We deal with models all the time. And so when he's throwing different kinds of models, I'm like,
You're talking
I
about
like
the
this.
nested doll idea?
Yeah, he has nested doll.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, that's cool.
And then the tree.
I haven't actually heard anyone else say that in the tree with the branches and the roots.
All the forms make a tree.
So yeah, that was a lot of fun. He's a really nice guy.
He also talked about some interesting stuff too when he was talking about Chi Sao doing bridge feints. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah.
Just
I like
to verbalize
that,
you know?
Mm-hmm.
Put that in a conversation. It's not just something that you know is happening. Everybody knows it's happening, but when you actually talk about it, it changes it.
Yeah, he was talking about stuff I think that I really enjoyed. He was talking about stuff that I haven't heard anybody else say, so that was really interesting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right. So enjoy the episode.
Yeah, Kai Taylor. He's in London, UK. He's at kaiwingchun.com. Check him out. Welcome to the Wing Chun Discussion Podcast. I'm Vito.
I'm Dane. Today we have Kai Taylor from London. And Kai, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you today.
Oh, it's great. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. Real briefly, just how are things going in the UK right now?
Well, we're in lockdown because of the coronavirus, like a lot of the world. It hit the UK harder than a lot of countries, and a bit earlier than US. Life continues, but you're stuck in your house, and a lot of places are closed down. But they talking about loosening those restrictions maybe in July. But I think life's not going to get back to normal until next year. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is going to be different for a while. It does make a good environment for podcasts, so I guess that's one thing.
Yes, it does. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity.
So tell us a little bit about you and where you're from.
Sure. I'm a teacher of Kung Fu. I teach in London. I've been here for about 4 years. I'm Australian by birth, and my Kung Fu education started in Sydney, Australia, with my Sifu Jim Fung, and that continued. What I like to kind of think of my PhD in Kung Fu, in Wing Chun Kung Fu from Chu Shong Tin, which was his Sifu and my Sigung, and that was 3 years in Hong Kong full time, where I lived around the corner from him, about a minute's walk from him in Prince Edward, which was one of the most crowded, near one of the most crowded suburbs in the world in terms of density, Mongkok, and that was a great experience in my life. First time living overseas, and I've done it a couple of times since then. Since didn't go back to Australia, went on to Sweden for a year, and then into London after that and I've been here ever since.
Wow, I wonder. I don't know. I'm curious. What are the main differences between living in London and living anywhere else in the world? What makes London special for you?
London, people like to complain about the weather here, but London in summer is amazing, and that tends to be when the locals go overseas. It's a little strange for their holidays because it's absolutely delightful in summer. It does get pretty cold and miserable and dark in the winter, but nothing compared to Sweden, where it's totally dark at 2 p.m. It looks like nighttime in the middle of winter. Yeah. I would say that after living in Hong Kong, where the density was really, really high, people complain about the number of people in London. I don't even notice it. It seems fine to me. So it's a great city to live in. It's very culturally rich. There's always something to do. It's one of those cities that never sleeps, and I'd say up there with, not having been to New York, but it's up there, say, with New York in terms of being like a world city, in terms of just pretty much the whole world is found in London.
That's cool. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff to do.
Oh
Always
yeah,
something to do.
always something to do. Very any sort of niche interest can be catered for. So, for example, I'm a big movie buff, and there's not just one but several cinemas that just show old movies. And it's great to be able to go see your old favorite classics in the cinema, at least for me, but not at the moment, of course.
Something
Yeah.
we've noticed is the popularity of martial arts, particularly Wing Chun in the UK.
Yes.
Any,
Yeah.
what's going on with that? Why is it so popular there versus some of the other Western countries?
My theory is that it's got to do with when immigration goes into the country, like immigration from Chinese countries like Taiwan and Singapore and uh, Hong Kong and mainland China, and but also when Chinese people come to study in Western countries, they often have a few years of experience, maybe less even sometimes, but and they ask their sifus back home, can I teach? Can I teach here? And they usually given permission to, and so they'll start teaching, and that's often how it starts. That's how it started with my Sifu Jim. He was working for the government and as an accountant, I believe, and he was just teaching Wing Chun on the side. And it just grew. The interest was so huge that it was able to grow into his full-time profession.
Mm. Yeah. So the immigration makes it a little bit easier.
Yes, and so
Um,
Australia is very, very close to, like Hong Kong and so on. So
mhm.
there's Australia is a real hub for Wing Chun. I'm not sure if people around the world know that, but it really is because of the Chinese immigration went back to the 1950s. New Zealand to a lesser extent, but yeah, it's. I think that's the main reason. But when it comes to the UK, it's a little bit more. It's further away, so that changes things a little bit. But I think it's still the same basic process.
Yeah, because I noticed like when I'm browsing videos, like either like if it's on Reddit or something being shared, a lot of it is coming out of the UK. It's more infrequent to see stuff coming from America.
True. It depends on the lineage as well. Certain lineages kind of seem to spread around the world in different ways. So, Jim Fung was a kind of real dominant force representing the Chu lineage in Australia. So it's quite very well represented there. Whereas so that's the lineage I'm part of. That's almost unknown in the UK, except for thanks to YouTube and the internet these days, people are
Hmm.
exposed to lineages outside their own, and therefore almost all my students come from previous Wing Chun lineages where they liked the idea of the Chu approach and were willing to try it out.
Can you speak a little bit about your experience with Chu Shong Tin?
Sure. I first met him in Australia, where he would come on a yearly basis to give seminars at Jim Fung School. He'd give a week of seminars, and they
Hmm.
were like my favorite week of the year. At the time, I was doing a certificate for Wing Chun instruction, which is like this kind of government paid course to study Wing Chun. And once I heard
Hey,
about that, I immediately signed up to it within a millisecond. I didn't even have to think about it. I was like, get
wow.
get paid by the government to do kung fu. What's the catch? Uh, so I was living in Perth at the time, which is on the western coast of Australia, and in 2 weeks I had to start the course. So I dropped my entire life and moved across. I got a second job to pay for the plane ticket, and then moved across. And uh, so I met him within, I guess, the first year of doing that full time course. He was doing his first seminar. I went to three of them, three weeks of them. So it was like they're very long. They went for like 6 hours a night, and
Oh
so there's a
wow.
lot of information covered. And that kind of gave me the theoretical foundation for the Chu lineage in a way that was not necessarily covered when he taught. When he taught, he was it's what I often consider like a more traditional Chinese approach, which is you're kind of just told uh, what to do. You can
Hmm.
ask questions, and there's a kind of understanding that Western students ask a lot more questions than Chinese students, and
Hmm.
that Chinese students like that in a sense because they listen in to the questions they wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily have the audacity to ask. Um,
Uh-huh.
and these during the seminars, he was very like a professor giving lectures on the theory. It was very theory laden, but what was cool about it is he would give you theory, and then he would show you how he did it, and then he would show you how you could do it. And he had a real gift of being able to communicate through the sense of touch how to get someone to kind of simulate what he was doing just through manipulating your joints and your muscles with his hands.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's
So
amazing.
that was the kind of like first introduction, and then I went to university as a mature age student. I didn't know what I wanted to do earlier, and I was like, I kind of after I finished the course, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do kung fu. Not so much I wasn't sure. I guess I lost confidence that I could teach it, that could turn it into a career. I went, okay, I need to do what other serious people do and stop having this fun lifestyle of kung fu and get a real job. And so I went to university and studied philosophy. And as you do, if you want a real job, you study philosophy and psychology. So it was a science degree. But at the end of that, it pretty much just gave me the philosophical tools and psychological tools to understand myself, which was, guess what? You just want to do kung fu. so then I moved to Hong Kong, and I was very, very, very fortunate to train with Chu Song Tin at the time.
Wow. I'm still laughing. I'm still laughing at that. Yeah, tell me, like, what was when you went to train with him? So I understand he's like passing on a lot of information and then, showing you. But I'm wondering, like, what did the class look like? Was it like, in the beginning with lecture, and then you guys have some drills and stuff like that?
Definitely not that. So that's kind of the point I was getting at with the lectures he gave, or the seminars. They were very theory laden, and whereas the way he taught was incredibly informal, and it was broken up into two halves. There was the afternoon halves for about 2.5 hours, and then you'd have dinner for an hour, and then you'd come back. And the first half was very chatty. It was very social. People would just be talking and training, but it was very social. Lots of chi sao and that sort of stuff. But the teaching style was very individualistic. So everyone was really just doing their own thing, and he was your kind of like personal coach, customizing his instruction to each and every person there. Because on a busy night, it would be, I don't know, 30 people. But on a lot of nights, it wouldn't be that busy. And there'd be a mix of international students and local Chinese students. And but that was the kind of dynamic in the afternoon. It's very, very social. Whereas coming back from dinner, it became almost like like that kind of quiet silence in a church. It was very much like that, where it's very silent.
Oh,
People
really?
were very introverted, very inside themselves, inside their bodies, exploring what I call the energy circuits of energy flowing around the body. They'd be doing that, or they might just be doing a single movement from one of the forms for an hour. So they might just be doing a single movement from the dummy form, or a single movement from the knife form, or the pole, or anything like that. And it would always be whatever the person was doing. And unfortunately, at the time, Sigung was sick. He was dying of cancer, but he was when I first arrived, he seemed very ill, but he kind of went off Chinese. He went off the Western medicine and then went on to Eastern medicine, and that seemed to lead to a radical improvement of his vitality. And
Hmm.
he was just a teaching machine, really. He just taught nonstop for 6 hours, didn't sit down. He was always looking for the next person to help. And so because though that he was sick, he was in that second half. He would often spend an hour of that, say 2.5 hours of that second half of the period, going through one of the forms every night. So there might be, okay, for the next 6 months we're going to do the dummy, or the next 6 months we're going to go through the pole, so that
Hmm.
everyone was exposed to his most recent understanding of each of those forms.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a really remarkable time to be with him in his life,
Yes.
where it's like he's facing his own mortality and he's like dedicated to his students at the same time.
Yeah, I have a favorite memory, which is, it's not my memory. It's shared from a teacher of mine in Australia called Mark Spence, who's a great teacher there. And he was, just to set the scene, at the bottom, he lived in the Sigung lived in the same building as he taught. It was just on a different floor, and he'd go down between floors to have his dinner with his family during the dinner time. But Mark was downstairs watching the security camera for the elevator, and Sigung's in the elevator, and he's kind of manipulating his own wrist, and he's kind of playing with his futsal, trying to perfect his own futsal. And it's kind of like, how are you supposed to catch up with this guy? He just lives and breathes Wing Chun. And
Hmm.
I remember reading an article where he kind of laid out his kind of his training regime, and I just did a back of the envelope calculation of the number of hours he trained. It was just ridiculous. Like I'm sure you've heard that idea that 10,000 hours it takes to become a master. My back of
Mm-hmm.
the envelope calculation was it was conservatively like 160,000 hours of Wing Chun. So
Oh my god.
he was in the early days he was doing like morning to night teaching when he had his open to his school, and then after a few decades of that he got a little bit lazy in quotation marks and got that down to like 8 hours a night or something. It was just he had a real very very strong work ethic, and he loved to teach.
That's amazing. Yeah, he had the passion, and then he also loved to teach. So,
Yes,
uh,
and because I didn't speak Chinese, you learn the words, right? You learn the kind of key words, and there's a kind of
uh-huh.
like a language you kind of you learn, but it's a lot of it's about like a bit like learning, say, dancing. Could you learn dancing from someone who doesn't speak English? The answer, I think, is yes. You could learn it quite easily. A lot you can learn Wing Chun without much language, much easier than say you can learn Wing Chun online, right? Which is what a lot of us are forced to do at the moment because of the virus. I do a Zoom class with my students.
Yeah, actually, that's been my experience too. Like I've been online with other people, just meeting other people in different areas, and then when I'm trying to show somebody something, it's very difficult. You have to do it with words when it's best described with feeling, with
I,
touch.
I agree. But that's my teaching approach though is to use touch. This is a little different, say Chu, which was with Sigung. He used touch very very well. My approach is I use touch almost as a last resort, which is I want people to understand the concepts. I'm really big on the principles of Wing Chun, that the forms are actually manifestations, embodiments of very clear principles, which can be explained and we can go into,
Hmm.
and they the best way you can kind of do is get the person to understand what you're doing with demonstration, of course. And then if they're still not getting it, then you kind of puppet their body as a last resort. And I find that, in my experience, that leads to them really understanding the martial art. And that's been my big thing is I want my students to really understand Wing Chun as I understand it, and then so that it's theirs, and then it'll be Wing Chun as they understand it.
Mm. Okay, so it sounds like your approach is like you first want to make sure to get the cognitive part down, and make sure that they understand fully I don't know, how could I say,
The theory, right?
the theory.
But
Right?
I'll
Yeah, yeah.
but I'll add though just to that it's you can't armchair it. You've got to learn the theory while you're doing the practice. So like in philosophy they call there's theory and there's praxis, right? The application of theory. So I had one student who used to have the problem of always wanting to be told, okay, but tell me more. And I go, I've just been telling you what it is, and now you need to do it. What I've told you about, I've explained it. The next level of understanding comes through embodying that understanding, making it inside your body, and you won't understand it separate from that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that kung fu is like when you do kung fu, it's a personal experience. It's your
Oh yeah,
uh, expression of the art, right? So
sure.
um, you need to be able to do it in your body and understand it through that, right?
Yeah, I think it'd be like trying to learn how to dance, but never dancing. That doesn't
Yeah,
make any sense.
yeah, cool. Tell me a little bit more like about the principles when you're talking. Like, you know, Wing Chun has a lot of principles with the Kun Kit and things like that. But what are some that are important to you?
Okay, I'll start with by describing what I call the nested doll model of Wing Chun. You know those often called babushka dolls. I believe the Russians call it something different, but
Yeah,
those kind
the
of
one.
dolls within dolls.
Yeah.
That's a good model for understanding the relationship between the forms, particularly the first three. So the way to think about it is there's a little tiny Siu Nim Tao doll inside a hollow Chum Kiu doll, and they're both inside a Biu Jee doll,
Oh.
right? So there's a Wing
Uh-huh.
Chun principle. So in a very real sense, if you don't actually understand Siu Nim Tao, then if you're doing Chum Kiu, you're not doing Chum Kiu because it's like trying to drive a car without an engine. And same thing with Biu Jee. If you don't understand Siu Nim Tao and you don't understand Chum Kiu, then you're really just imitating Biu Jee. You're not actually doing Biu Jee.
Oh, interesting.
So I can go into what the principles are. The
Hmm.
the the first one's the hardest to talk about with Siu Nim Tao, but again, because it's one of those things, it's a bit like describing food to someone, and you can't confuse the description with an actual meal. But to just on a theoretical level, like a working hypothesis would be that it's the art that teaches you to master your mind-body connection. I think that's the easiest way to kind of communicate it to both a beginner and to someone who's more experienced, is that you're at the end of it, your sensitivity and control of your body is taken to an incredibly high degree.
Interesting. And that's with Siu Nim Tao.
With Siu Nim Tao, yeah. So so you can look at that on the level of biomechanics. So there's so let's talk about what it's restricting, right? So there's kind of like, you can think about each of the forms as imposing rules upon the body, restricting movement, as well as what is allowed. So with Siu Nim Tao, you're in stance, you can't move your hips, you can't move your knees, you can't move your ankles, you can't move your spine, and all movement is in your arm, right? So you've got a stationary stance with arms attached to it, and you're learning, therefore, kind of two things there. You're learning how to move your arm, and you're learning how to have a stance to support that arm. Then if you go then to Chum Kiu, there's less restrictions. You're now able to move your feet, right? You're able to move your hips. You're able to step and pivot. But you're not allowed to move your spine yet, right? Your spine is treated as a rod. And then if you go to Biu Jee, there is all restrictions removed. You're allowed to move all the joints in your body for the purpose of Biu Jee. So stepping back, what are the principles for each of the forms? You've got the mind-body connection for Siu Nim Tao, and then with the ultimate purpose of taking all that is required. It's actually quite complex. People often say Siu Nim Tao is simple, but there's actually a lot to it. And the real art to it is, the real art to simplicity is bringing order to that complexity to make it simple. Not by so it's like Einstein had a great quote, which was, make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I find that applies very well to Wing Chun. And so with Chum Kiu, it takes that those principles and that way of moving, that mind-body connection, that way of thinking as well, and then it adds its own principles. So there's a mistaken belief that it's just the same principles over and over again. This nested doll model says that no, Chum Kiu has its own explicit principles, and why wouldn't it? Because why wouldn't you just have one form? If there's just one set of principles, you just have one form. So each form in Wing Chun is teaching a different set of principles that builds upon the previous set. And with Chum Kiu, it's built into the name. Chum Kiu means searching for the bridge, or bridge detection. It's often translated in. And from my own study, I think those names are a bit inadequate. There's kind of two English translations I like, which are bridge probing, in the sense of almost like interrogating an opponent, say. Probing in that sense, trying to find out what's going on, what's the truth, in that sense of. But an even better one, I think, is pinging, like a submarine that pings off another submarine with sonar. So you're sending off a pulse of when you say you're touching someone in Chisao, you're sending out a pulse to detect what's going on inside them, and just like with a submarine, if you send out signals and to get the echoes back, you may be betraying your own position to the enemy. So you're trying to collect as much information as possible, a bit like with a poker face. You're trying to give away as little as possible, or deceive the opponent with false information through the bridge, right? And then just to finish the nested doll with Biu Jee, it's sorry, I need to step down a bit first, which is the Chum Kiu theory is quite simple in that it breaks down into two concepts that go into that concept. So that concept of bridge probing is made up of two concepts, which is there's a concept of force generation, which is combining the force from what I call and Sigung used to call the shoulder girdle power, which is the power that comes from moving the arm with the shoulder girdle as opposed to just with the shoulder joint or with the elbow, and moving from your center. And the center is a complex subject, so we'll just use the word center for now. But moving from your center, combined with moving from your shoulder girdle, over and over again, if you look at the movements in Chum Kiu, it's teaching you how to coordinate those two things. And that's one half of the principle of Chum Kiu that goes into the bridge detection, bridge probing principle. And the other half is two-way force. So I'm not sure if you've heard of this idea, or I'm not sure I'm not familiar with how common this term is outside of my lineage. So maybe you can help me out there.
Oh, explain it. This is fascinating. So please keep going.
Sure. So two-way force is Sifu Jim like to use the term multi-vector force because technically it doesn't have to be two; it can be more than two. But in my experience, you have to grasp it as two first, and that's the traditional name for it. So I prefer using that one because before you can do 3 or 4 or 5, you have to do 2. That's the first idea, and that principle is simply when you're generating force, you can generate it in 2 directions at once. And therefore, you can use those 2 directions to achieve 2 different purposes. So a simple example would be you can use one of those directions of force to push their arm out of the way and the other direction of force to hit them.
Mm-hmm. Like an example would be like a pakda, like with both of your hands?
It could be with both of your hands, or it could be with one of your hands. It can be with using force, where the force is generated from your body by stepping or pivoting, and your arm in the other sense, from your shoulder girdle, or it could be a blending of the two. So there's different ways of thinking about it from the way you described to more where the energy, where the force is being generated from.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so we have a double directional force. We have pinging. I love the idea when you were talking about the it's like searching for the bridge, but when you're saying like probing or pinging with the submarine, that I've never heard that explained that way, but I like it because it brings in I think some of the principles of Wing Chun. That's like the one that I like is open the door for the opponent and slam it shut or something like.
Yes.
Like you want it on your own terms without the opponent knowing what's going on.
Yeah, there's lots of metaphors for it. The Chinese have lots of colorful expressions for it, and that's a great one. The metaphor I like using is there's a species of spider that is specialized for hunting other spiders. So it doesn't weave webs; it hunts down other spiders on webs, and it has, depending on the spider it's attacking, it'll have different strategies. Like it may drop from above and kind of just land on its back, and kind of like a ninja, kind of like parasail down on a single thread. And for other spider species, though, it'll go to the edge of its web and it will tap, almost like Morse code, vibrations into the web, because these spiders don't have very good vision. But they have a sense through the web of what's in their web. So they send signals into the web, false signals that mimic struggling prey.
Ooh, sorry.
Right? So you can kind of think of that. It's sending out a false signal through the bridge, and it sets someone up for thinking that there's weakness when there's actually strength, or strength when there's actually weakness.
That's fascinating.
That's really interesting concept.
Yeah, so Chum Kiu can be quite a sneaky form in the application in fighting and in Jisao. It's quite because you've got this ability to feel through the bridge. And by the way, my understanding of the bridge it's often translated as just being about your arm is the bridge. It's like synonymous with your arm, or sometimes with your arm plus their arm. But if you actually imagine in your mind 2 people chisawing, their whole bodies look like a bridge together, right? Their body is supporting the arms. So you're not manipulating their arms so much. You are, but you're manipulating their body as well. So you may be manipulating their balance. You may be trying to tense up certain parts of their body. You may be trying to send a sort of sensory, what do you call it?
It's
Echo.
almost like a feint.
A feint.
It's almost
exactly.
like you see a feint in boxing. Now you see a feint in the bridge. And
Exactly
it's a
right.
sensitivity feint.
It's a sensitivity feint. Exactly.
It's a higher level.
Yeah, very, very, very much that. So, for example, you may actually give the sensation that you're about to attack low through touch, and you're not attacking low. So it is a very strong equivalent of a feint in boxing, just not through touch rather than without touch.
Mm-hmm.
The metaphor of the spider is a really good example. Touching the web and sending the signal. That is a perfect example of what you're trying to describe here.
Right. And so ultimately, at the highest level of Wing Chun, what we're all aiming for is eventually you're defeating the opponent's mind through their body, of course, but you're actually attacking their nervous system and their psychology. So you're creating you're creating a false picture of reality in their head, and that means they can't attack you properly. So I'll give an example from Sigung. Something that I've never felt anyone be able to do, Sigung Chu, is he could disengage his arm and hit you, but in the very act of disengaging, it's very hard to communicate this in words without feeling it. But with most people, if they disengage from their hand from my arm, I can feel them disengaging it, right? They may be quick enough to hit me, maybe not. But with Sigung, he created a sensory echo as he was leaving your arm that was, for a split second, you still felt like his hand was still there. I don't know if you can conceive of that, but that makes him basically, he can hit you whenever he wants because you don't realize that he's gone to attack when he's gone to attack. I don't necessarily believe that Wing Chun has a monopoly on some of these concepts. I think that a lot of them are quite unique to Chinese martial arts from the kind of Canton region. I do think Wing Chun is a very, very concise and dense form of this. The way I kind of think of it is Wing Chun is standing on the shoulder of giants. There's like 3,000 years plus of R&D into martial arts, and Wing Chun is taking that to the next level. It's a relatively young martial art, like between 300 and 400 years old, and it's very young, but it's resting on all that. So the founder, which I don't spend much time thinking about who the founder was or anything. I just but she plays an important part in my thinking that there was a single person who thought of this, because I've had experience with committees, and committees don't create anything, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah.
So getting back to the theory that with Biu Jee, it's building again on that last one, and it's very simple, Biu Jee, which is the principle behind Biu Jee is how do I maximize acceleration? That's it.
Okay.
So the only reason you would ever want to do something that reduced acceleration would be some other very important factors, such as safety for yourself and how you're performing it. Maybe some sort of other important needs, such as defensiveness in the action. But the primary drive in everything you do is how can I squeeze the most out of acceleration to perform this movement.
So, like, that's evidence in like the Biu Jee moves, like underneath the elbow coming out like that.
The way I think of it is, you look at the engine, right? So you can think of there's three engines. The Siu Nim Tao engine is this kind of stationary body, and your body is like this force sponge. So it has this amazing ability with a trained stance to absorb a lot of force. And it has a dynamic balance system built into it. So it's not about bracing off the ground in any sort of static way. In fact, you're actually facing the opponent in such a way that forces you to use dynamic balance, right? With this kind of inward turning front on stance. It's forcing you, if there's any sort of force coming at you, to use dynamic balance as opposed to static balance to overcome their force. And you're developing your stance and that. So that you can kind of think of that as the engine, if you will. And then in Chum Kiu, you're moving. You can kind of think of it as you've got like artillery, and now you've turned it into a tank by putting some treads on it, right? So it's now you've got the ability to move it around by stepping and pivoting. So this is a mathematical thing. So Wing Chun, to me, has a very strong. It's not one thing. It's the way I really think about it. It was invented by a genius, and geniuses don't think simply. They're very profound thinkers, and it's kind of like the definition of what foundational is. If you tap into the foundation of something, by definition, you're tapping into the foundation of everything. So Wing Chun isn't just for health. It isn't just for martial arts and fighting. It isn't just for meditation. It's all these things, because it's built upon these very, very fundamental. It's built from. It goes into the fundamentals. Is I guess the way I want to put that. Yeah. So so you've got this Siu Nim Tao ability, and then you've got this the Chum Kiu one is stepping and pivoting. So what I was wanting to refer to there was, mathematically, there's only logically two ways of moving an object. So they call it translation and they call it rotation. So translation is where you move something, say, on a 2D surface, up, down, left, right. And in 3D, it's up, down, left, right, forward, back. That's translation. And then there's rotation. So an object can be rotated in 6 degrees of freedom. So pitch, roll, and yaw, just like a jet, say. And so mathematically, Wing Chun this understanding is built into Wing Chun. So in Siu Nim Tao, it's built into the understanding of how to rotate the joints, particularly the shoulder joint, this pitch, roll, and yaw. And so there's a very deep understanding of this in Chu style Wing Chun. I can't comment about other lineages, but it's very deep in what I've been taught. And in Chum Kiu, it's that same idea for the body, which is this pivoting or stepping. So the restriction is you can only rotate in one of those degrees of freedom, not the other 2 degrees, right, of freedom. So you're not pitching, you're not rolling, you're kind of yawing, I guess. It depends on your point of view. And then you're stepping pretty much just forward and back, right? You're not stepping sideways. So and it separates the two. So every time, if you kind of look as you go through the different sections, what is often labeled, the A section, B section, C and D. That's breaks up into four. Siu Nim Tao does. Some people break up into three, but I break up into four. Same Chum Kiu breaks up into four parts, and you'll often see this kind of repetition of the same move over and again. You get this kind of bong sao with a wu sao position done with stepping, done with pivoting, and so on. So there's that principle of putting either pivoting or stepping as the engine for your arm work.
Well, how does it go into the Biu Jee? What's the engine there?
Right. So the spine is able to move. So rather than any particular move being fast, the idea being there's another principle which is like a more secondary principle, which is it's the form that teaches you extreme ranges of movement as well. So it teaches you how to move, hit things that are very close to your body at high speed and things that are very, very far away. So it's the one that teaches you the longest range, but also the shortest range of striking. So you have these very short range elbows, for example, and then you also have these very long range fingertip extended Biu Jees, right? Taking things to the absolute maximum distance. In which, so you compare the distance from Siu Nim Tao to Chum Kiu and then to Biu Jee, it's very, very large, the range when you free up the movement of the spine. And so that's the key difference is you're able to move your legs and your hips in Chum Kiu, but your spine is not allowed to move. It's considered an iron rod. It doesn't have any parts from your tailbone all the way up to your neck, the bottom of your neck. Your neck's allowed to move, but you can think of it as T1, a thoracic one, all the way down to your coccyx. And that's like a rod, and you're teaching yourself to move that way. And it's not a natural way of moving. People want to twist their spine, and if there's any sort of flaws in their footwork when they're pivoting or stepping, they will move their spine inappropriately. And so it's about taking that out. But then in Biu Jee, you're putting it back in, and it allows you're able to move. It still continues that degree of freedom, but it now has all the different parts rotating in the same direction. So whereas Chum Kiu you can think of as the form that teaches you to mobilize your mass, almost like it's one big solid atom, right? And you're rotating this thing as a solid atom, or translating it, or stepping with it. But with Biu Jee, it's about recognizing that the body's made up of parts, and you can create a kinetic chain from your foot all the way through your center and out through your arm, and that every link in that chain is an opportunity to accelerate the next link and the next link. So it leads to an exponential increase in speed.
Wow, that's so interesting to hear you talk about that. Talk about it like that.
I think the problem though is it's very easy to understand Biu Jee in that sense. The problem is if you go straight to trying to move that way, there's a very good chance you're going to hurt yourself because you haven't learned how to protect your spine. So think about it. If you're actually going to extreme ranges of motion, that means you're twisting your spine a bit like a towel. You're twisting it all the way around, and therefore you've lost that natural alignment, which is conducive for absorbing force. So an easy way to think about it is like, say you're lifting heavy weights. I don't know, you're doing a clean and jerk, or you're doing a deadlift, or any of these sort of exercises. If you just imagine twisting your spine all the way to the side or leaning over as you do it, you should instinctively kind of rebel against doing that because you're going to cripple yourself. Right? You always want to have it so that your body is in a locked-in position from your hips and your shoulders. You don't want them twisted. You want them symmetrical. You want your shoulders over your hips. So even if you're hinging at the hips, there's still that unity of that of the body from the coccyx all the way up to the neck. So that's not to say that there isn't subtle movement that's going on, but it's very different than what's going on in Biu Jee, where everything is rotating as much as possible.
Right. And so, like you were saying with your nested doll theory, you need to have the principles first without any movement of the legs and the spine.
Yeah.
To Chum Kiu with the spine not moving, but now the legs moving. And so then you finally get to the Biu Jee.
Right. And so by the time you've gotten to Biu Jee, in my research into the language, one of the translations of Biu Jee was something like the utmost tiny tips on branches. This is the more poetic part of the language. And excuse me, I don't speak Chinese, so this is with 5 English to Chinese dictionaries open in front of me. So to my bilingual Chinese friends, please forgive me for getting any of this wrong. But basically, one of the translations I came across, which I thought was very suggestive, was the utmost tips of branches of a tree. So it bring into mind like the tree's like a hierarchy. You got these roots, and you got this big trunk, and you got these branches that start going in a fractal sort of way, going to the smallest
Hmm.
part. So I take that to mean lots of things. Actually, I think it's an incredibly rich metaphor. But one of the things it's suggesting is that the tiny branches are supported by the trunk, and they're
Hmm.
supported by the bigger branches before them. And in the same way, Biu Jee is supported by Chum Kiu, and that itself is supported by Siu Nim Tao, which you can think of as the roots or the trunk.
The roots, right? Oh, that's a great metaphor for that. Ah,
Yeah,
so
so
interesting.
I think we can't. I'm not a historian of Wing Chun. There are people that do that work, and I think more power to them. But my interest has always been Wing Chun itself, and I'm not really interested in the kind of the mythology of Wing Chun in terms of the stories that kind of went along with that. But I kind of approach it more like a philosopher, which is that martial arts only a few hundred years old. What are the elements that we can be sure have not degraded in the passage of passing on? In the because there's always the chance with every generation you're passing it on, there's a chance of error being introduced into the tradition, right? That's
Yeah.
why I'm always emphasizing critical thinking with my students, which is it's essential for you to think for yourself because it's so easy for the moves to get done incorrectly. Maybe we can go into that later because I think it's something very fascinating about that. Something I'm very fascinated by is
Hmm.
the error rate. But going back to this is what can we be sure about in terms of the theory? And I came up with one answer, which is it's the name and the names of the six forms.
Hmm.
I think we can be very certain that in the last 400 years they have not mutated into another meaning, another word, right? So
Okay, they stayed
I
the
think
same.
I think the founder was very clever, which was there was the names have meaning. The names aren't arbitrary. The names
Hmm.
are the clue to the most fundamental principle of each form.
And so they've chosen those names as like a lesson to make sure to focus on.
Yeah, I think they
Yeah.
understood that that there's this is the time before YouTube, right? That we can't be recording thousands of hours of the founder, and so there was this understanding that that they this we can assume that the founder was well versed in multiple martial arts. That's the kind of mythology, and I agree with that. They understood the martial arts that were around them, and they used that to inform their creation of Wing Chun, and that means they had exposure to how anyone can experience it. Anyone who's actually gone to multiple schools can realize there's differences between how everyone does it, even within the same school. Like a
Hmm.
lot of people who travel, like going back to Sigung school, he would have people traveling from all over the world to train with him. And it was very old school. You needed a letter of introduction. And I saw people travel there who didn't have the letter of introduction and they couldn't get one and they had to go back home. And they're like, but we've come here from Brazil. And they're like,
Oh my gosh.
and then one of Seagull's students would be doing, passing the bad news on, which is, sorry, you need a letter. And I've had friends who didn't have that letter. In fact, when I moved to Hong Kong, I didn't have that letter because
Oh no.
I was kind of stuck between my seafood gym had died, and there was a kind of I was in kind of a grey zone who my seafood was. There was a kind of uh, the senior student at Adelaide who didn't know me. He kind of inherited that ability, and then there was the seafood gym's wife kind of inherited it from there. But I was actually kind of training with one of her competitors now, like one of his seafood gym's students opened up a school and was a competitor. So I was kind of stuck within a rock and tar place where no one would write me a letter. And
Oh wow.
I don't care. I'm moving to Hong Kong anyway because as a leap of faith, really, it really was. I had no logical reason for doing it. In fact, I had a friend who'd done the exact same thing, and uh, he was there for a year and couldn't train with Siegel. And I just was like, if I get to train with some of his senior students, I'll be happy. I was at a point where I was not doing Wing Chun in my life and was not happy for doing that. And then I realized that it's one of those. It's like a deathbed regret. If I didn't continue this journey on Wing Chun,
Mm-hmm.
I would regret it. So I did it, and
Mm-hmm.
then without going into the details, through amazing level of coincidences that make you question the structure of reality, that it's a lot. The universe is helping you out. The way I like to put it is, if the universe will meet you halfway. uh,
Uh-huh.
and sometimes you do need to take a leap of faith, which people who know me laugh at that because I'm a pretty rational fellow most of
Yeah.
the time. Yes, but some of the most important times in my life, I've done those leaps of faith, and they've worked out for me.
Wow, that's fascinating to hear about, about your perspective and about your life. The whole time you're talking about the theory of the Wing Chun forms, I'm thinking about your decision to go into the philosophy degree, and I think it's really it's really coming out, you
Well,
know.
I studied philosophy because it was Western philosophy. I'd been kind of self-taught, you could say, in Eastern philosophy, very, very into Buddhism and Taoism in particular, less so Confucianism. I guess it's a little too authoritarian and hierarchical for me, but not to say it doesn't have its value. But I was really attracted to the kind of poetry of the Taoism. It's a short book you can read again and get something out of every time you read it, I find anyway. And
Yeah.
but I was exposed to a lot of people in Wing Chun who are often attracted to martial arts. They already kind of have a kind of aesthetic. They kind of like they like the martial arts aesthetic, and these people they get the Chinese tattoos and all that sort of stuff. And sometimes, not saying all of them, there's definitely a small minority of them, but there'll be a small minority who their attitude is, I kind of already understand this whole chi thing and how to get the chi power before they've even done a single class, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of turned me off the idea that Wing Chun had a spiritual aspect to it. I was like, I'm going to explore meditation from the East separately from my Wing Chun training because I'd been kind of turned off by these kind of fellows.
Hmm.
They're kind of hubris and arrogance about it. But to my surprise, in Hong Kong, when my training got to a certain level, it totally fused together. So I realized, oh my god, Wing Chun is not just about fighting; it's changing uh, your perspective, my perspective on life, right? So the same perspective you use in your training gets universalized, and I was not prepared for that. I was very surprised for that to
Yeah.
happen. And for like 2 weeks, I was walking around in a daze where it felt like this kind of algorithm that I'd gotten from Siu Nim Tao was going through my memories and my visual system and my identity. Every aspect was getting fine tuned by this simple idea, this tiny idea, in a way that can't be described easily, to put it
Yeah.
mildly.
Another practitioner I was talking to, I think he was describing something like that when he said, if you know the path, if you know the path to something, you can find the path to all. And I think that's kind of describing what you're talking about, because as you learn Wing Chun, it's been my experience too. You can apply those principles to everything,
Right. Yeah.
because the
Because you've
foundation
gone
is
really deep,
there.
right? You've gone deep,
Yeah.
deep into the fundamentals of something. And the more fundamental you can take your learning in any particular field, the more it can then tap into what is fundamental in all of existence. It sounds I don't know hippie-ish and like what have you been smoking? But it's technically true. That's the way I see it. It follows logically. And
Yeah.
the I think it's not just Wing Chun. If say an artist who was a visual artist and they took their art to the utmost, I think they would also be tapping into things that are fundamental beyond that. Not that doesn't necessarily mean they can take on 20 ninjas, right?
Yeah.
But they're tapping into something more fundamental in life that goes beyond their painting, and they would become an expert at learning. So that's I think Wing Chun's taught me how to learn, and so I learn new
Hmm.
things very, very quickly because of Wing Chun.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can relate it to something else that you've learned because you've had that journey, right?
Yeah, it becomes this deep deep reservoir of metaphor for the rest of your life. So yeah, I didn't expect that. I didn't seek it, in
Hmm.
fact I was turned off by it by as I said, that small minority who went
Uh-huh.
into it with a kind of arrogance. And in my opinion, I kind of consider them, they'd stick around medium term. They wouldn't be there for a few weeks, but they wouldn't be there for years. They'd be there for a year max, when they kind of realized that the people that they started with, they were looking down their nose at, like, I understand this better than you do. I don't, you don't understand. This is very deep, this martial art, and I understand it already. And
Hmm.
the other ones would be slogging away at it, right, getting better.
Hmm.
And then in a year's time, they'll be like, this person I was looking down my nose at is now better than me, and their ego can't handle that, and they leave.
Oh, wow. That's the part where they should stay and take the
You're
lesson.
right. That's right. That'd be the time where they should be humbled by the experience. And I had a great
Yeah.
teacher who used to joke. He had a great sense of humor. That I asked him one time. This is when I was just beginning. I was like, Instructor Michael, what is the meaning of Wing Chun to you? And he goes, it's the path of constant humiliation.
Yeah. There's
And what he
always
meant by
someone
that
better
was,
than you.
Yeah, you're always going to be. There's always someone better, and you're always going to learn that you don't. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, and there's so
Of
much more.
course.
It's much more complicated than you thought, and that you don't understand it. And Sigung Chu used to joke that when someone asked him how long does it take to master Wing Chun, he'd say 1.5 lifetimes.
That's funny. A little more than you can do.
Right. So there's always more to learn. I feel very fortunate to have chosen. I did some other martial arts before Wing Chun, but I feel very fortunate that Wing Chun's the one I decided to specialize in because it's fascinating. It's not. I think with some martial arts I might get bored of them. Not all, of course. I have a lot of respect for other martial arts, and I've done other martial arts, and I've done other martial arts while during my Wing Chun journey, and I'll do other martial arts
Hmm.
into the future. But Wing Chun is endlessly fascinating to me.
How do you see Wing Chun in like the greater world of martial arts? How does it stand up? How does it stand with other martial arts?
Yeah, I'll answer the question the best I can, but it's not a question I like to answer for the comparison. But let's do it. Uh, I think Wing Chun has a role in the wider martial arts community, such as, for example, I'd love to have some MMA fighters who would like to learn Wing Chun. I'd love to teach them. I wouldn't consider
Hmm.
them. I wouldn't be telling them they should only do Wing Chun in the octagon. I see it as a specializing in a striking art. It's not something that naturally applies to the ground. That's not to say that if you didn't learn a ground fighting martial arts, say that you couldn't apply
Hmm.
Wing Chun principles to it. I'm just saying there's no forms for it. There's no easy mechanism. I'm not that sort of teacher. So when I have students who want to do that, I always give them my blessing. Go learn from an expert. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on ground fighting, and
Hmm.
maybe one day you can teach me the ground fighting with Wing Chun principles in it. So I'll teach you the Wing Chun principles as best I can, and that will give you that'll put you in the best position to come teach me one day. So
Hmm.
so that's my perspective, which is it's something that could be part of a toolkit with these kind of modern day gladiators that are pumped full of painkillers and are basically like the Terminator, where you can't hurt them because they've completely destroyed their moderated their
But
pain sense, right? And it's perfectly
yeah, we
legal,
haven't
unlike say.
we haven't seen one rip off the face and reveal the
Right.
the
So,
robot underneath.
like I'm sure a lot of people, I have a lot of respect for those guys. I have a lot of respect for other martial arts. They're doing a fantastic job. But I think that over time you see like an evolution in the metagame where as they all being able to do the same bag of tricks, they're having to look for edges. So you start seeing I can't remember certain names off the top of my head, but you do see certain martial arts trying certain things from Wing Chun or
Mm,
something similar to Wing Chun, like trapping and that sort of stuff. And I don't see
yeah.
them trying to do this kind of unbalancing type stuff with that trapping so much. It's more just kind of yanking the arm out of the way, but it's
Hmm.
surprisingly effective in some contexts, right? And the other evolution which I've seen and I kind of was anticipating was this evolution towards linear striking as a way, this kind of low kicks into the leg, attacking the knee over and over
Hmm.
again, or linear punches as opposed to more wild swings or circular strikes, just because of the efficiency. And so you see this kind of evolution, and it's not necessarily from Wing Chun. In fact it's often from karate or from anything, right? That's the thing. If it's fundamental, that's my perspective. Is if Wing Chun has any value to it, it's tapping into something fundamental, and other martial arts, the same thing. If it's to the extent that they have some truth to them, they're tapping into something fundamental. And some are. It's not so much a style thing as such, even though they're logically some styles may have more to offer than others, particularly in certain specializations. It's more
Hmm.
the individual and themselves, right? It's the individual martial artist who is the ultimate measure. So if someone can kick my ass, it doesn't necessarily shine like bad light on Wing Chun. It just shines bad light on me.
Yeah, it's the individual. Yeah.
Right. And the other aspect I'd like to talk about with the place is it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, which was the way Wing Chun spread around the world. You often had people teaching it who were not very versed in it. So there's people. I think it's a personality difference. Some people are fake it till you make it guys, whereas I devoted my life to Wing Chun. You know, many hours each week. When I was doing my full time course in Australia, it was 60 hours a week, 3 years, and when I was in Hong Kong, similar sort of hours. Uh,
Hmm.
and I was devoted to that. And there's other people who go, they're more, I'm great. I'll fake it till I make it. I'll start teaching. And so there's a lot of people when they spread around the world in this kind of university sector and they needed students, they didn't necessarily understand Wing Chun very well at that stage. They were kind of learning as they went, but they were better than there was a demand for the martial arts because of Bruce Lee movies and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so there was a kind of lack that. So that's explains one of the things it explains is why does Siu Nim Tao look so similar around the world, roughly speaking, right? To the educated eye in every lineage, it's going to look very different, but roughly they look the same. Whereas as soon as you go away from Siu Nim Tao into the later forms, you get radically different. Radical differences in even what the number of movements or what the movements are or what they're for. It's because of that, I think, that they were coming back home every Chinese New Year to learn their Sifu the next form, and they would do that for a few weeks and then they'd go back and teach around the world. So and then unfortunately things like Yip Man movies, they get people into martial arts, but it also gets a lot of people teaching who maybe aren't the greatest teachers. So I didn't start teaching until I felt comfortable teaching, which was about 15 years of learning. And whereas some people, they feel comfortable teaching after 3 months. So it's not that's none of my business. I God bless them and God bless their students. But it's not. It has this inevitable consequence, right? Which is a diluting of the brand of Wing Chun. And I'm sure you've seen this online where some people get very upset by this. With Wing Chun, we need to stand up for the Wing Chun brand. And I'm not really concerned about that. I just see it as I just want to teach Wing Chun the best I can and do my part in passing on this beautiful art that was taught to me and in preserving it. And I see myself as a researcher, removing any sort of corruptions that have been introduced along the way.
Interesting. I wonder too if like solidifying the Wing Chun brand, as you said.
Well, they see it as a kind of a stain on Wing Chun that there's all these fake martial artists out there and stuff.
Yeah.
And there are. We all know that. There's different degrees. I think, though, maybe that's one of the advantages of this kind of coronavirus is a lot of us are being forced to go online who would otherwise be quite reluctant to, because, like for myself, I just thought, you can't teach this online the same way you can teach in person. But after a few weeks of, I was just forced to for survival. So I'm now teaching my students online. They like it, and it's working better than I thought, in fact. Whereas I think in the early spaces, you have a lot of people who are teaching. I'm not opposed to people making money from it's their job and so on. That's great, but are they offering good value for that money, or are they just really good marketers? Right? Are they just extremely good at creating a marketing machine to push things? And that's a separate skill, which I admire. It's not something I think I have a lot to learn on that side of things. But I think that's the context people are coming from. Is sometimes they get upset that there's some bad Wing Chun out there. And my advice to people is just ignore that and just find yourself a good teacher and concentrate on your own training.
I think that's great advice. Focus on yourself, focus on your training. Get rid of the noise so that you can hear yourself.
Right. Yeah. And that's it, right? It can end up being a distraction from the journey you're on, right? Was that really because someone's wrong on the internet? Do you really need to get in a fight with them? Right? Like, was that part of the journey? Is that what you signed up for?
You don't? You don't have to stay there and have a war with them?
You don't have to go, hold on, honey, someone's wrong on the internet. We must combat them, right? So anyone who's publishing online realize there's trolls and they say nasty things. And I knew that before I started making my YouTube videos, where you get nasty people. I had a friend actually send me a list of people to pre-block. So who's
that's great.
Who's got millions of hits and stuff, and he's like, "I'll give me some advice. Here's a list of people that save yourself trouble. just pre-block these people."
I haven't heard of pre-blocking people yet. So
I haven't figured out how to do it yet, so I don't know what he meant by that. But I've got the list, so I look at it every time someone's
so funny.
Someone's got their name. I go, I wonder if they're on it. I haven't found one yet, but it was a nice gesture.
So we're gonna wrap it up here.
Sure.
And Kai, it's been really, really great talking to you. Your theoretical mind has and your perspective is absolutely fascinating. Really.
Thanks, Vito. I've really enjoyed this, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm sure. I mean, it sounds like you have a lot more to say to say too. You have so many great ideas.
Thank you. It's Wing Chun is obviously a passion for me, and it's like a life purpose. So it's I see myself as a teacher, and teaching makes me happy.
Yeah, I understand that. Great, man.
Well, thanks, Vito,
So
and thanks, Dane.
yeah, so we
Thanks,
have
Kai. Really great.
yeah, Sifu Kai Taylor, and he can be found at kaiwingchun.com, also facebook.com Kai Wing Chun UK, Instagram Kai Wing Chun, and you're in London, UK.
That's right.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Wing Chun Discussion Podcast. Log on to wingchundiscussion.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. More episodes are available on iTunes, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.